everyone. I thought I'll just explain how we're going to do this. I'm going to take about the first 10 minutes or so, then Sue's going to take the next 10, and then we're going to huddle together here at the front for the last 10 and see if we can conclude it together. And it's really nice to see you all, and I hope this is going to be a sort of an interesting exploration of some of the ideas that we've been thinking about and developing over actually quite a period of time. But the conference that Phil referred to just now has also informed a fair bit of the thinking that's gone into this presentation, so we've amended it slightly from that point of view. So, obviously, giving yourselves a hard time, we've got the challenging times that Phil referred to, but also the impossible professions. So, those are some of the main theoretical ideas that we are discussing today. So, what we're going to be thinking about is, it almost sort of breaks down into a few sections, but hopefully the links between them will be fairly clear. We've got theoretical perspectives around this idea of impossibility in teacher education. Also then, we're going to explore a little bit further some of the policy and political context that we're actually operating within at the moment. And Phil's referred to this already. I know that many of you are acutely aware of that, but in fact what we're going to try to do is sort of link those things together, and particularly with in terms of the implications for teacher professionalism. Tensions between performativity and accountability agendas. And these ideas about what being the good teacher actually mean. What do we mean when we talk about the good teacher? And then, although we have set out those challenges, and I hope we'll be doing justice to some of the kind of the scale of some of those challenges, we would like to propose some ways forward, because we are very interested in thinking not just this is difficult, but this is perhaps what we can now do. So, I think when you are a beginning teacher, I think something of the impossibility of teaching dawns on you quite slowly. Now, there's a lot of teachers in this room, and you may disagree with me, but actually, when you start teaching, you have your first observations, then you start taking small groups and small parts of lessons, but it all feels quite controlled, hopefully, quite manageable. I think that then, because that school environment is so familiar to us all, that phrase of we've served an apprenticeship of observation, so we're all very familiar with the school context. The actual complexity of what you're doing isn't immediately very apparent. And a number of writers have written about this actually over a long period of time, but actually in terms of the idea of impossibility have come at it from different levels. So a lot of writers at the moment, or thinkers around this, are referencing Freud, who lumped teaching together with healing and analysis and government as being one of the professions in which one can be sure beforehand of achieving unsatisfactory results. I think, of course, if you think about this idea of you can be sure of achieving unsatisfactory results at the beginning, it sits in a very interesting tension with some of the kinds of ways in which the teacher education or the teaching system, actually the education system works now, in which in fact the results are actually fairly clearly defined, however you might think about that. David Brixman refers also to that thinking and develops this idea of impossibility around areas of psychoanalysis and some other areas. With this idea of uncertainty and complexity, including the impossibility of completion and of knowing the other. I've got something to say about that in a moment. And also by Green, who was at the conference that we went to and presented at. And he writes a lot about acknowledging that impossibility, but claiming that vocation holds some of the answer to moving forward. When he talks about vocation, we talk about vocation too quite often. And it's a very loaded term, because when you think about vocation, it can have some connotations that some people think are unhelpful in this context, particularly ideas of not necessarily religious or spiritual aspects, but those to do with self-sacrifice and those sorts of other motivations. When Bill Green talks about it, he talks about a calling to a profession that has intrinsic value, so that you feel that you are involved in something that has has a value that is greater than some of those immediate rewards and outcomes. And I think that that's something that certainly resonates with us. I'd like to go back slightly to Brixman there with this idea of not knowing the other and this impossibility of knowing the other. When I described that seeming simplicity of the classroom at first, and you think, well, yeah, I can handle that, you know, getting some people into groups and asking them some questions, getting them to feedback. It's only, I think, later, as you develop in that professional knowledge, that it starts to dawn on you that this sea of 30 faces in this lesson, the 15, the next one, and so on and so forth, of what are they actually getting from this in the broader sense, not just the exam results that you hope that they're going to achieve, but what difference is it actually making to them as people who are growing, developing, and so on. You can, and I'm sure most of us have had those lovely moments that they tend to sort of tie into on teacher education adverts where there's the light bulb moment. They usually have with a bit of sort of sexy scientific equipment, and it's, yes, I understand how gravity works, or understand how this works, or that works. And you know, you have the moments where someone says, your teaching of Tennyson has you know, sustained me through difficult years in my life and all that sort of business. But you also have things like when I was in the hairdressers a few years ago, and one of the junior assistants came over to me and said, Miss, you taught me GCSE a few years ago. And I said, oh, great, how are you doing? How's it all? She said, I'll never forget it. I'll never forget that you're kind to animals. And I said, really? Where did that come from? She said, well, you got really upset when you read out the bit about the dog being shot. And that was her abiding memory of 2 years of GCSE teaching with me. It was the thing that really stuck. And when I was reflecting on it afterwards, obviously I'd rather she remembered me as being kind to animals rather than cruel to them or something like that. It did also make me think that when you're a teacher, you sometimes, or often, don't know what someone will take from it about you. You can be the person, as we say at the beginning, who makes the big difference in one way or another. So it's that complexity of it too, and that comes down to the sorts of relationships and communication. So to go in slightly more detail into Green's idea, I hope you'll forgive me for a slightly longer quotation, but I think it does say quite a number of things that I'd like to explore here. That this is surely the fundamental dilemma of professional practice, enacted constantly and even unceasingly at all levels. The impossibility of knowing enough, of having enough information on the basis of which to make the right decision, in all the urgency and drama of the moment, and yet the necessity of doing so, of acting, of moving on. The imperative to act and doing so without guarantees. Teaching and teacher education alike are thoroughly caught up in this essential, inescapable dilemma. This is the idea that is referred to, not just in this context, but in others, as aporia, the unresolvable paradox, that you are constantly confronted by the situations that seem to have so many dimensions to them. They have the dynamics of all the people in the room, of what you're trying to teach, and all of the other constraints that are acting on you at that point. And I think that is what, as we'll develop later, we think is actually so critical to hanging on to in terms of teaching and teacher education, and not being frightened of that complexity. Similarly, if we go on, my position, this is Brixman, is that there is no such thing as teacher education without us creating the conditions to tolerate and value the uncertainty of development as a strange and even alienating resource for understanding the great conflict our field absorbs, creates, and lives within. And I think that's particularly interesting because this idea of being happy with the uncertainty, happy with the things that you can't control and the things that you can't know, is part of the resilience of being a full professional. If you try to reduce everything down to controllable elements, in fact, you will end up something which is, I think, reduced, simplified, and very, very misleadingly and dangerously so. If you do try to determine those outcomes, as in fact we have to, or the education system as it stands requires us to do, you will also restrict those outcomes. And of course, that's also something that we think about when we think about our trainee teachers, our beginning teachers, when they are asked sometimes to determine all the learning outcomes. What's everyone going to learn? What's that group going to learn? What's this group going to learn? And so on. So what does this all mean for us? So some of those ideas, I think they really need much further exploration. But if I bring it down to, for us as teacher educators, as distinct from training, education as distinct from training, which is the great sort of dilemma we're caught in at the moment. It embraces the uncertainties and dilemmas of teaching. We invite challenge and criticality. We spend a lot of time thinking about how else could this be, in other words. It is about the other possible ways something can be. We also emphasize change and turbulence in education policy and practice. There's a strange tendency, I think, in the way policy is sort of developed and enacted in this country, that you arrive at a system that almost seems to negate all of history. So you'll have people who've only been educated in a certain system. They think it's always been that way. The same thing comes around with phases or cycles or fashions in teaching. And I think one of the things that we do all the time is to disrupt that and say, it doesn't have to be this way, what if it's a different way? That leads into the next point, which is that we believe that professional resilience then is dependent on being able to make those decisions and judgments based on the evidence you have at the time and based on all of those things that have just gone before. If you are happy with that kind of instability, if you're happy with the things you don't know, then you will be able to weather the changes. You'll be able to weather what is different. And I think also we also stress that teacher formation is always a work in progress. You don't come out of your initial teacher education the fully formed teacher. Now that's quite almost feels like a heretical statement at the moment, because we are, as you know, operating within a system where, for example, we're supposed to have our beginner teachers exiting as outstanding, that they will then go into their first teaching job and will still be outstanding, and that will continue. And there are some very difficult consequences to that not being the case. I think what we would suggest is that there could be an outstanding beginning teacher, again, within a sort of a range of judgments and a range of ways of understanding that, but that you always go on developing and understanding and experiencing the complexity of the job, and that you'll continue to do that. So the rest of the talk is going to, I think, unpick some of that too. And as I just said then, the policy context is in many ways sort of diametrically opposed to some of those beliefs, those key beliefs that we have about teacher education. We have frameworks for planning and assessing and monitoring teaching that are predicated on what's knowable and measurable. So, for example, if you have children coming into a school, very, very simply stated, baseline data, rafts of it that are about that child, and then it predicts what they should come out with it after however many years, and the stages they should be going on, and the sub-levels, and so on and so forth. It's as if you are able to measure all of these factors and variables and so on, and of course we all know that just can't be the case. But that's obviously very highly contestable. And teacher education, or teacher educators similarly, we're also caught in that tension between auditing and evidencing. So we need to show, because of the system that we're operating within, that we are tracking as much as we can track, that we're monitoring and measuring. But we also need, and we are very passionate about, protecting the space for academic and professional growth, for acknowledging, for embracing all of that uncertainty, all of those difficult dilemmas, ideas, and so on that people will encounter. And that complexity of education is therefore being marginalised in favour of the simplicity of training, and actually to quite an extreme degree, as I think Sue will be talking about later. Of course, what a lot of this highlights is what it's like to be within a system which is sort of based on accountability, performativity. It's been described as, I think, the terrors of performativity. Solberg's work on consequential versus intelligent accountability is useful there, in the sense of consequential accountability is you do things because you're frightened of the consequences of not doing them. And then the idea of intelligent accountability being that you do things because you have been able to weigh up the situation, and you've been able to make judgments based on that process. What we'd like to suggest is that we're working towards something called moral accountability, where it's got a broader perspective and goes beyond the single classroom, beyond the school, beyond the curriculum context. And is around, is this the right thing to do, rather than, am I doing this right? So it's not just about the mastery of technique, it's not just about all of those strategies that you use, but in a much wider context, is this the right thing to do? And it also ties in with an idea of vocation. I mentioned vocation just then, in the context of Bill Green's work. But there's also a couple of other references which are quite important to the way we've been thinking about this, which is that teaching is at heart a virtuous normative activity demanding an array of moral sensibilities. Vocation is the moral voice in the teacher's identity. The idea of the moral voice, I think, is something about this idea that you are in a position of responsibility and power, and you need to be aware of all of that. You need to be aware of the consequences of what you're doing and hold all of that in balance while still being able to actually act. And that is the difficult thing, because this comes back to the aporia. You will not always be sure that how you're acting is going to have all the consequences you intended. But being aware of that dilemma is part of the actual point of it. It's a vocation is for us then a dimension of professionalism that reflects that wider social, academic, practitioner concerns. And it includes, but it's not restricted to the local. It's concerned with long-term goals and objectives, and it's concerned with the holistic. And at that point, I'm going to pass over to Sue for the next section.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, I'm just going to focus for a little bit on some of the context. Partly because that's the framework in which we have to operate as teacher educators. Directly, because there is a lot of challenge politically to our jurisdiction. And also in terms of what Jean Murray refers to as our role as sort of second-order practitioners. So we are slightly removed from the school classroom, but we are very concerned with the work of what's happening in the classroom. And particularly at the moment, there are quite dramatic changes that have been happening, still happening, and we have to help work through those with our trainees and our mentors and with teachers in the schools. Stephen Ball talks about a sort of a curriculum restorationism. It's kind of not so much back to the future, but forward into the past. So there is so much going on at the moment in terms of perhaps narrowing of the focus of the curriculum and changes to assessment. So there's a lot going on for us to be concerned with. Stephen Ball, who has written a lot about education and about social class and policy, talks about the current system of education in England is beginning to resemble some aspects of the pre-1870 system of education. The distribution of responsibility for the solution of social problems is changing now. Philanthropy and business are essential parts of the delivery and policy processes of education. And actually, they're also in there in terms of teacher education. So what we have now in School Direct are opportunities for philanthropic alliances, but those perhaps more in an entrepreneurial spirit, to actually get involved and take a role in teacher education. So that opening up of the marketplace is very interesting. He also notes, and I think it's an interesting quote, in the process of reform, the relationship between government and state education has been articulated by criticism rather than partnership. And I think that's something we'd feel quite acutely in teacher education. So there's boundaries being crossed, and the pace at which this is, if you like, changing, and those who are involved in teacher education is widening, is illustrated with these figures. We're looking, even internally at our university, a massive growth in school direct, school-led, but in our case we're looking at school direct. School-led is that wider notion of the involvement of schools. School direct is one particular, if you like, take on that, but an awful lot is going on. The government aimed for 50% of the numbers to come from a school direct, a school-based and a school-led system of teacher education. And they're there or thereabouts. The SCITs, the school-centred initial teacher training providers, actually replace the university. And their role, they can award QTS. And interestingly, they may or they may not choose to have a postgraduate course connected to that. There may be no master's credits. So the profession is no longer, if you like, aspiring to be a master's-led profession, which would be far more the case in other countries. There are options, and I think perhaps one of my concerns would be that the consumer, if you like, the applicants, the trainees, may not even realise what they're buying into in some cases. That's not always clear. So there are implications, obviously, and I think I'm trying to articulate the university perspective, but I'm very conscious we actually work with some very good school partners who are actually the right partners, who actually share our vision and are working well with us. And so it's interesting, and there's a tension in trying to defend what the university stands for without seeming to be perhaps not respecting anything that the schools have to offer. And we know we work with lots of schools who are very successfully in partnership. But it's just interesting that schools are in a much more of a position to actually challenge, and even just by the fact that they are involved in School Direct, in a sense, it is a challenge to our own jurisdiction, to our authority to take the lead. So it's a very interesting tension, but it is one, and that turbulence has caused some universities to actually close down their teacher education. So that space is reducing, which I think should be of concern. I think also, which is interesting, is this relocation. It isn't just the physical change. It's the what goes on in that space. McIntyre and Jones have written about, drawing on Barbara's work, about third space and about the importance of the HEI, the university having a space in teacher education, of what we bring, and actually justifying it because it's not school. There should be a different physical space for them to come. And it's one of the things that we would say is part of our additionality and complementarity. We are there to actually let them have a space to be a little bit more critical, to step away from the busyness of the school. And I think that's quite a key aspect, that there is a danger could be lost in a school-led system, particularly with the SCITs, where they may not spend more than perhaps 6 weeks in another school. And in fact, in some cases, far less than that. There is now a salaried route, which schools by default are paying them to work in that school. So the moral capacity for the school to say, actually, it's far more important for you to spend time elsewhere, having an expansive learning experience, well, that's costing them. So there are dilemmas there. So it's got quite big implications for where and what is done. The neoliberal imagining of the solutions in terms of this market is also interesting. It is rigged and it changes, and I think it's interesting. We need to be aware of all of these things that have happened. The 60 days that used to be the number of days for secondary training, that was problematic for a lot of school-leds, so that's been removed. That was perhaps one of our levers to say it's important that there are 60 days here being facing training, quality time, days, not twilights and Saturdays, but days, to think and discuss, navigate the pedagogies, the principles, and what schooling is all about. Another original outline for the school-led and for school direct was that there would be a job at the end. An expectation of employment has now become very loose, and there is no compunction on schools to take the people that they are training. And again, that has some implications. Some schools take it very seriously and have not gone for large numbers because they want to keep within the spirit of what they are doing. Others are taking on vast numbers, and I think have feel no moral duty to actually guarantee the jobs. So that's interesting as well. And obviously, it's another side of it. The schools that are the movers and shakers in this field, a lot of them are the teaching schools, and by their very nature, they are the successful schools in this system. They are very good at the measurements and the league tables. So again, a kind of very particular environment a lot of the beginning teachers are being trained in these schools. I think they're all kind of contextual things we should keep in the back of our minds. Again, another one, I suppose we should be grateful though, the schools that are involved, and certainly with us, value the QTS. They are actually involved in wanting to create teachers. We still have now the ability of academies to actually recruit people who don't have QTS. And again, I think this is one of the discourses from the government about what do you need to be a great teacher? And the answer is brilliance. You know, a good degree from a great university and nothing else. And that's something that we, again, as teacher educators, need to rally against and watch that. And I think it's interesting, their line at the end there, no existing teacher contract is affected by this minor change. A minor change to say it's now okay to have teachers who have no qualification and really no training other than their degree. So the marketplace is, it's set, but it doesn't define the discourse. We have, as I say, we have a duty. We're working to find the right partners. But it is interesting, this school-led, there is a great deal of emphasis on cost and perhaps not enough on value. And what we're trying to do is to navigate this field, to find those schools that actually have a lot to contribute, have a lot to offer, but there is a mutual respect for what we bring and for what you have to offer. And together, I think, hopefully, we will take this forward. But it is interesting to see. And Charlie Taylor, in his brief to schools, you know, the language is, the discourse is very clearly around this commodification of education. So the schools are seen as the customers. They select who they want to work with. They're advised to shop around, look for the best value. And we've certainly had some of those conversations where it's all about how much, what can we get for our money. And again, it's very much about saying, you as schools should decide on the content. You should be dictating to what should be in that training programme, how much should be at university, how much in school, and getting the right person for your school. So again, it's quite a reductive system where don't worry about the profession, just worry about what will meet the needs of your school now and very particularly. And I think that's something that we have to be, again, quite aware of. And again, not all schools think that way, but this is what they're being encouraged to do. Interestingly, at the conference we were at, Meg Maguire from King's College actually said, really though, the true customer is now the trainee. It's the applicant. You know, they can shop around. They now have the freedom to choose which route they want. And I think that's where we have some work to do, because we need to persuade them that actually they need to have a route that PGCE or School Direct that has actually foregrounded some quality academic endeavour. And that's not the case in all of the school-led. And I think it's quite interesting that, in a sense, they are not informed and they do not necessarily know what they're buying into. And it's got quite big consequences for everyone. Okay, so I think we've got some concluding thoughts sort of around the background. I think the challenge for us is to think very clearly, and I think one of the positives perhaps in the face of adversity is that it's making us be very clear and articulate very fully what we are about. And for me, it's around this idea of the good teacher. I'm using the metaphor of the tree. For me, it's like the roots and shoots and the two levels at which we have to operate. If you like the effective qualities, the shoots are the visible. But really, it's around the roots and that fertile ground in which we grow those trees to actually make sure they are resilient and that they can weather all of what comes their way. And we need to find the right schools that also share that view. The danger otherwise is that, you know, we're only growing one kind of tree. And we've got the teacher that will survive in this school because this is what we've trained them for, this one school. Or perhaps, you know, an even more dramatic version is this kind of pop bound where it's a very limited, specialised experience almost all the time in that one school. And the chances of them being able to survive if they were replanted somewhere else, well, that might be questionable. And I think they're things that we need to be concerned about. For the roots, and I think Jane's going to pick it up, but I think we need to also think there are challenges for us, and as teacher educators, it is about us thinking about the different pedagogies and practices that we need to undertake. Pam Grossman set out a challenge, and I mentioned it last seminar I talked about pedagogies of enactment, and about practice theory, about us being very concerned with supporting and developing that, and through some quite high leverage practices. And I think we have to make sure that we justify the additionality that we bring and the complementary experiences. We need to work with schools, and we need to do that in as democratic a way as we can. And there are lots of opportunities. So it's not all negative. There are lots of ways in which we can, I think, make improvements and reimagine and move forwards.
Thank you. So just a few final thoughts then. Helpfully called Pedagogy of Hope, although not about us necessarily, but nevertheless. Okay. We are very concerned with this idea, as Sue's referred to, that the way that some ideas of teacher training are going is that it's such a narrow idea about what a teacher actually is, but that we are trying to bring form teachers that have this much broader perspective. It's also a much broader, I think, range of abilities, resilience, and so on. So the hope an individual teacher has for his or her students is vital, but it's limited if not accompanied by broader social hope and reform. It can't just be about that next set of results. It can't just be about that next set of data for the school. And, of course, it leads us into some interesting, I think, questions around what we do, because we return again and again to this idea of the hope teacher. And, of course, in that most perhaps unlikely of places, the Ofsted report, the hope teacher who takes the full part in professional school life and teaches with moral purpose the whole child. I do think about this an awful lot because it's such an intriguing thing for an Ofsted inspection to have found. But I think that shouldn't make us complacent about it. We need to keep thinking about what does that moral voice that we referred to before actually mean. We've got to really think about the parameters of the regulatory framework and what this means in philosophical and professional terms. Very nearly there. So when we think about the good teacher, we're not just thinking about the effective teacher, we're not just thinking about the teacher who can do those things which are around the sort of technical aspects of the job, but encompassing all the elements that we've just described. And I think critically being able to sort of step back from all of that time and time again, and really own the space around what does this all mean. Part of this too is about reimagining professional learning. As Sue said, we've been almost put in false opposition with schools, and we've never really seen it that way. Schools and universities have always worked in close partnership, or that's the best model that there has been. Close partnership with school colleagues who can bring the other distinctive elements to this whole package. And we've been sort of set against them in a way. But I think we need to be thinking about those transformational rather than transactional partnerships, those ways of working. We need to be reclaiming professional jurisdiction or claiming our distinctive contribution within that. And also innovating responsibly, so with partners who aren't just interested in those sort of narrow goals and outcomes, but also in this wider project really of what does good teacher formation actually mean. Final slide then, claiming the space, or claiming our bit of the space. I'm just going to refer to Viv Ellis's paper here. Higher education teacher educators have to absorb the demands of relationship maintenance. So this is something we've just been referring to, that also this new system also means that you spend a lot of time actually negotiating, renegotiating where you actually are and how you can actually operate. And you have to absorb those demands and also other non-research activities within institutions that value academic capital in terms of academic outputs, quite rightly so, and also in competition with others, like, for example, schools, that don't have to do that either. So there's a really kind of neat catch-22 going on there. However, the opportunities for impact of all types, but also academic impact in terms of the REF, is really significant, and that shouldn't be relinquished. You know, there's a really important fight, I think, to be had there and to be won. And so, to use Viv Ellis's term, there's a need for courageous minds to defend the territory, both externally and internally, academically and professionally, not just for our own sakes, but for the sakes of course, the whole school system and all the pupils that we actually end up impacting.